My name is Pedro Faria. I'm speaking on behalf of HealthTech Portugal, and we have now today the pleasure of presenting and briefing to you guys really an amazing solution and team and company called Dandelion Health. Dandelion is headquartered in the United States, and so I'll just make a very short brief that they will then resume. So first of all, I would like to thank our team, Vanya and Patricia, for the setup of the webinar. And Dandelion Health is a healthcare technology startup focused on enhancing clinical development and commercialization through advanced AI tools and extensive real-world patient data. And we know how relevant that is in the last couple of coming months. So we have today with us Armend Cobovic, Director of Products, and Nick Gossen, Head of Growth. They will lead the webinar. We will have the chance to put up some questions on the chat, and then they will decide if it's relevant to intervene immediately or they will reply during the Q&A session. We will have also available follow-up one-to-one meetings for people who want to get more in depth into this area, and also, of course, talk about their own issues and challenges that they would like to be solved with our support. Lastly, the webinar is being recorded. I think everyone's okay with that, but it's just a disclaimer. So I will now pass the floor to Armend and to Nick. Thank you.
Very quickly to jump in, Armend, if you can go to the agenda slide. Here's what we're going to cover today. We are going to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. We'll spend the bulk of our time talking through then our training and validation platforms. And then at the tail end, we'll mention in passing a handful of other things that we do, which may or may not be of interest to some of you, depending on what you're focused on. And then we'll leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A. As Pedro said, please feel free to put questions in the chat. I will keep an eye on it. If it's appropriate, we'll address it immediately. Otherwise, we'll bucket those towards the end of the presentation. As I said, I am Nick Gossen. I'm head of growth at Dandelion. I've been in the clinical AI space for about 4 years now. I worked as SVP of strategic initiatives at a company called Cobovic Health, focused on the radiology AI space. And before that, I spent a number of years in various strategy roles at Oscar Health, a health tech insurer here in the US. Armend, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, nice to meet everyone. Armend Cobovic, Director of Product here at Dandelion. My experience comes from various places, including kind of academia as well as some startups, but overall have worked in the AI specific product space in both deep learning as well as just overall creating data platforms at Mayo Clinic, at Butterfly Network, at Memorial Sloan Kettering before then. So very nice to meet everyone. Pass it back.
So we're really excited to be here with all of you. Thank you to HealthTech Portugal for the introduction to all of you. We have spent the last 4 years building a clinical AI data platform that we think has the potential to really help a lot of companies, particularly startups like yourselves, get to market faster and better, especially in the US, but across the globe. Fundamentally, this is our business model. We partner with large health systems in the US. We extract all of their raw clinical data. I'll tell you more in a bit about what that means. We then aggregate it, we structure it, we clean it, we make it readily usable for a wide variety of industry partners. So AI developers, researchers, biotech companies and pharma companies, and med device companies. If you go to the next slide. So this is sort of a visualization of what we're going to go through over the course of the rest of our presentation. We'll sort of go through each layer of this cake in turn and tell you about it in detail. At the bottom level is the data. Like, what are the data that we get and where does it come from? Then what do we do to clean it and prepare it to make it easy for developers like you to use? And then how do we package that up into specific products that solve problems at different steps of the AI product development journey? I will go through the bits in blue, and then I'll turn it over to Armend, and he will go through the bits in green. All right, so where does our data come from? As I said, it comes from several large integrated delivery networks in the US. The three that we have data from currently are in dark green: Sanford Health, Sharp, and Texas Health. We have a fourth that we'll be announcing in the coming months that's located in the New York area. As you can see, what we are doing is we are trying to get good geographic coverage across the US. So the fifth, which we'll be announcing later next year, will probably be in the southeastern United States. And really what we're trying to do here is get a broad cross-section of US healthcare. The data set that we have today represents about 10 million patients. It will be 13 million patients once we add the fourth health system. That represents 60 hospitals, somewhere in the neighborhood of 16 million annual visits. And it is broadly representative of the US population. It is longitudinal. We are going back to 2016 and extracting all of the data from 2016 to the present with quarterly refreshes. It is fully multimodal. It is not just the EMR, but also the waveforms, the radiology images and the reports, the pathology report, et cetera, et cetera. I will go into more detail on all of those et ceteras later on. And the goal is to make it really truly representative of the US. As I'm sure many of you know, when you are applying for approval in the US, the FDA increasingly cares about not just the overall performance of the algorithm, but performance across a wide variety of different demographic subgroups. And obviously that's of relevant for any pharma companies or global med device companies that you may be interacting with as well. I think the last piece to mention here is when we say integrated delivery networks, what we mean is these are not just hospitals, right? They also have primary, secondary care as well. So we selected these health systems very carefully with that in mind, because we wanted to capture the full patient journey from end to end, including before a diagnosis. If you are looking for example, risk stratification algorithms or early detection algorithms, this should be a uniquely well-suited data set for those types of use cases. The other factor that went into deciding which health systems are represented in our network is these are all regionally dominant health systems. So let's take, for example, Sanford Health up in like North Dakota and South Dakota and Nebraska. These are predominantly rural states. Sanford is the only game in town in many of these communities. And so what that means is the data coverage for the patients who are there is unusually high, and it's usually robust, unusually robust. They're not getting a lot of care outside of Sanford healthcare. Okay, next slide. So this is double clicking then into the demographic point that I made. In this table, the rows here are various underrepresented demographic groups, which will be of particular interest to the FDA or to any other stakeholders who might be buying your solutions. And then the right-hand column here, we have each of the different health systems and then the US average. And what you see is that any one of these health systems is sort of a lopsided demographic group, right? For example, THR is overrepresented in terms of Black and Hispanic patients. Sanford is overrepresented in terms of Native American Indian and rural patients, et cetera. When you aggregate them all together, you get a pretty good representation of the overall US census, and this is a key piece of information that's necessary for a really strong FDA submission. Next slide. Go ahead and click through, Armend, to here. Okay, so let's go into a little bit more detail on the types of data that we have. On the left-hand side here, you see sort of a bunch of boxes that show all of the various clinical information systems that we are getting data from within one of our health systems. The example that we have here is Sharp Healthcare in San Diego. Now, if you were to go and develop a health system partnership yourself, which of course you're perfectly capable of doing, some of you probably already have some of these relationships in Europe. The challenge that you will face, and you probably have faced, is that every health system is its own precious snowflake of complicated IT systems. And so we have here a sampling of the actual health systems within Sharp, right? There is Cerner, their inpatient EMR. They have a different EMR for outpatient, they have Allscripts. They also just migrated from those to Epic a few months ago, and they haven't yet harmonized across the historical data and the new data. They have their PACS. They have a different PACS that they use for their echoes for some reason. They have their claims sitting someplace else, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so they have all of these different systems. They're not connected together. You can probably go and get an EHR data pull, but that's going to be just, sort of a summary of a lot of these different modalities. In order to get the real stuff, the things that you need to build robust AI algorithms, to source really robust ground truth, you need to actually go to these specific information systems. And that's what we do. We extract the data from all of these individual systems. We move it into the health system's cloud environment. There, we de-identify it to the strictest standards for HIPAA in the US. We then, once that has been approved by the health systems, we then pull it all over into a centralized AWS repository where we turn it into, something that looks like what's on the right-hand side here, right? We take all of the various fields, we look across all the various data sources and create nice, clean stage tables. So the diagnosis table, for example, is not just pulling from the EMR. It's also pulling from, for example, the ECG cardiology notes, right? If they diagnose AFib there, we have found that about 20% of the time, that diagnosis does not find its way into the EMR. And so by centralizing and staging all of these data sets, you get a much better, higher fidelity representation of the actual patient care. You see here some of the modalities that we have. We're going to have all of the usual stuff that you would find in an EHR: diagnoses, encounters, labs, vitals, et cetera. In terms of imaging and waveforms, we have everything that you'll see here. There are other things that are rarer, which we can get, but we don't necessarily have available off the shelf. If you have specific modalities that you're working with, feel free to ask, and we can answer that in more granularity. You're also getting all of the provider notes. So you see some examples here, but in principle, we have access to all of the various free text notes that providers are putting into the EMR. And then you see a few examples of things that we have on the roadmap, but are not currently available today: inpatient telemetry, digitized pathology slides, et cetera. You can sort of bucket these. There's obviously a lot of detail there, but just to provide sort of a high-level overview here, we've got structured data, semi-structured data, like reports from ECGs and echoes. We have DICOM images and videos. We have the waveforms, and then we have all of that free text data that I mentioned. What we have available right now are these sort of semi-structured and short-form free text data fields. So for example, radiology and pathology reports we can provide tomorrow. What is going to be available later in 25 is more of the direct access to long-form free text data. So for example, detailed cardiology notes, et cetera. Today, we can do the abstraction on our end and provide you with labels if that's what you're looking for, but access to the full long-form free text data requires some more work on de-identification, the challenging technical problem. Moving on then. So how does this all come together? In certain use cases, those individual modalities may be interesting and useful to you. But we find that where this data set is really most useful to our clients is multimodal longitudinal use cases, where you are looking at a specific condition. For example, this is an example of a patient with non-alcoholic um, fatty liver disease, followed by cirrhosis, right? And so these types of multimodal views where you've got a whole bunch of structured data for a patient, and then you have linked a bunch of these unstructured modalities, this becomes very useful in various tasks around diagnosis, prognosis, and early detection and risk stratification. All right. I guess this is, I think, my last slide here. In addition to all of that data, I think one of the main sources of value that we bring to the table here is, as I'm sure you know, getting data is one thing, actually getting it ready to use is something else entirely. And you know, the old adage is that it takes 90% of the time just getting the data ready for analysis, and then 10% of the time to do the actual analysis. What we have heard from our customers is that we can really help flip that percentage because we're doing a lot of the cleaning and the source profiling and the preparation and the transformation. You can just get right to the interesting bits, and then just save a lot of time and focus on where you can add the most value. So that is it for me. I will now turn it over to Armend to go into a little bit more detail on how our customers work with us.
Thanks, Nick. So first off, what is the foundation of kind of overall developing these AI products is truly this meaningful data set, and how can we design a really, really precise cohort for you guys to develop the products that are truly going to innovate healthcare today. So I'm going to use kind of a few different examples here, but what do we do really is help define and structure data in a cohort for you so that you can hit the ground running with developing your specific products and algorithms, right? So this is an example, our overall source data being kind of, let's say, ECGs and echoes. We have quite a bit. You can see here the unique number of patients here with ECGs from a certain health system versus the certain number of unique patients with echoes. You would provide us with inclusion exclusion criteria, and we'd help transform this larger data set into kind of this structured data set for you to then use to help train your models as well as gain kind of clinical insights as a whole, right? So just, as you add more filters, obviously this number or this N starts to trickle down. So you can imagine here, we have over 1 million ECGs in this use case. You start adding a bunch of filters here regarding kind of VT or VT ECG and echo pairs as a whole. And you can shrink it all the way down to something like 70 unique patients with 84 ECGs and 71 echoes, right? So the more inclusion exclusion criteria you add to something obviously shrinks that N, but we're able to provide kind of numbers or number of data points at every single one of these kind of filters, right? So we can help you decide, hey, what inclusion exclusion criteria do I find truly necessary to building this algorithm that might predict something like VT, or what can I kind of string back on so that I can get a larger number of data sources. So this is just an example. Another one for using kind of MRI abdomen with liver disease as well as ultrasound. This is another way that we kind of transform, right? So we have this number of MRIs, let's say, or this many ICD codes, and we do this kind of filtering through to develop kind of that true phase 1 cohort of what do you actually need to potentially deliver on developing an algorithm as a whole. We do this in a pretty nice contained kind of training environment. So once you provide us with your inclusion exclusion criteria, we sign off, hey, this is the data set I truly need. We actually give you that data set in your own kind of AWS SageMaker training environment. We give access to your users there. We provide that data set in an S3 bucket. You're able to kind of start training and developing your algorithm. And once you're ready, and you've developed the algorithm that you find kind of both accurate as well as representative, we can then, actually doubling down on this, we provide a bunch of different, I would say, preloaded software tools in your environment for you to be able to do things like explore the data set, things like obviously training via TensorFlow as well as PyTorch, some smaller annotation tools that are provided by Amazon as a whole, as well as you're able to integrate your GitLab or GitHub, depending on where you want to potentially share code amongst your team so that you could truly develop your algorithm as a team. So we provide kind of all of this within your own AWS environment that's within our larger enterprise AWS structure. Once you want, hey, I've developed my algorithm, I've used your data to as much as I could, we then provide a way for you to abstract your models as well as your model weights. So our overall agreement with our health systems allows us to give access to this data pretty quickly, right? So weeks versus sometimes developing this relationship with health systems as a whole can take years. The one caveat is that we don't download or send the data to folks, but rather you're able to develop the algorithm with our environment, and then you can take your IP with you, right? So you export your model as well as your model weights as a whole. So this just outlines kind of the overall, how does that work via S3 buckets? We provide kind of shared services and accounts, as well as your own kind of outbound S3 bucket for you to then take your algorithm with you. So outside of kind of training seems, quite simple in that sense. You get data, you're able to train your algorithm. But really the big question you want to really answer is, how does my algorithm work against a potential data set that is more generalizable or fits kind of all the criteria that regulators are looking for to actually approve this and get this commercialized, right? So we have a validation platform that does this. As you can see, the market is really moving towards this idea of transparency in AI as a whole, right? There are coalitions being announced. There are executive orders. There are all types of articles and papers being written about the current AI products that are out there. And I'm going to double down onto one of them, right? So there was a paper done pretty recently about the percentage of about 518 FDA approved products that were submitted to the FDA. So these were all approved, and they looked at the summaries of these products and how were they actually validated. And what they found there is, in the aggregated as well as stratified reporting, there was quite a few bias in various realms. So in this chart, you can see various ways, right? So patient cohorts, there were less than 2% of these 518 FDA cleared products had conducted multi-race and multi-gender validation, right? Another one, for example, is that less than 2% conducted multi-site validation. So they were very strict to certain regions or certain hospital systems where these were actually validated and proven that they can actually work, right? And then similarly, manufacturer as well as model. So you want to look at things, if you're specific to kind of imaging and waveforms, you really want to look at, hey, does your algorithm work on various machine types, imaging types, et cetera, right? So I think we're really moving towards this realm of needing to truly build algorithms that aren't as siloed, but rather generalizable across many factors outside of just race, ethnicity, but also things like medical device or manufacturer, geographic, you name it. So this is kind of what our solution to that problem really is, developing this idea of enabling transparency and using our data and our overall kind of hands-on or hands-off kind of platform here for you guys to get an idea of how does your algorithm work in various kind of factors, and overall stratify it by things like demographics, race, et cetera. So, you're a developer kind of looking to gain kind of pre-market setting or a post-market analysis when it comes to evidence of how does your algorithm perform. You actually sign up with us, you containerize your algorithm, you provide us access. You can either host it yourself or we host it. And then we would actually build your cohort around this. We'd run it against our data, and we'd create kind of a standardized validation report that you're able to kind of take to both regulators as well as share with potential hospital systems so that they're able to make better decisions of like what works for them, as well as it gives you insights into, hey, how might I develop this algorithm better or retrain this algorithm to fit more or check more boxes when it comes to performance as well as overall impact. So what are some validation outcomes, right? So obviously proof points for you guys as developers to support kind of commercialization. If you know where your algorithm's performing well or not so well, you're able to kind of go after those specific commercialization opportunities. You can look at things like, hey, where does my algorithm obviously have gaps, and look for real world data for retraining in those specific gaps. And then overall, this obviously, we have a big focus in transparency and health equity as a whole within clinical AI. So, I think we've chosen kind of 4 specific measures, or I would say categories that we like to really look at. And these are kind of the 4, and I'll dive into kind of these 4 as a whole. But obviously demographics, there's a lot going into things like social determinants of health as a whole. How does this work in rural versus urban environments? What is kind of how does this work regarding kind of income of those areas? Things like that. As well as I talked a little bit about doing some of this deeper analysis, things like hospital site, machine type, things like BMI even comes into play with a lot of imaging algorithms. How does this work on higher BMIs, right? So you really want to look into some of these counterindications for your algorithms as a whole. And I'll talk a little bit about the work that we're doing when it comes to impact analysis and how we're determining things like clinical and economic outcomes of your algorithm as well. So these are a few of we have a long validation report. These are different portions of that are actually available and paid by some of foundation partners that we've signed up over the years. But so just to start, we obviously look at things like performance. So AUROC, specificity, sensitivity. So we calculate all of this for your algorithm based on your inputs and outputs and ground truth within our data. So we provide this in a nice report. And then I talked a little bit about things like population impact, right? So how does this affect certain populations versus others within certain demographics as a whole? Talked a little bit about SDOH. So similarly, the SCAN Foundation wants to look at specific things when it comes to aging as a whole. So I think their efforts helped pay for some of this additions to our report around things like looking at how does algorithms perform in rural settings versus urban settings. Nick mentioned that we have a unique data set in this case. As far as aggregated goes, we're really able to look at both of these settings as a whole and compare your algorithm's performance in various sample sizes, right? And where is it under predicting versus over predicting? We provide kind of all of these calibration performance metrics around these in our validation service or report. And then overall, going back into kind of the specifics around site and machine type, as well as we can do stratification against other things like calendar year, right? One thing that other folks are looking at when it comes to monitoring algorithms is, was there a workflow change that might have happened that's affecting now my algorithm's performance? Is one thing that's an underlying bias that folks are starting to or beginning to focus on as a whole. So we're able to run your algorithm and look at your performance in our data set in a way where it's, hey, how is this performing by different facility types, device, patient settings, inpatient, outpatient, and then even down to the calendar year, right? Was this ECG taken in 2017 and now it's performing differently than ECGs taken in 2020? And what was that potential like workflow change that might have led to that is a question that a lot of folks are looking to answer as a whole. So talked a little about validation. I'm going to jump into some other platform offerings that we're working on with some clients that might be of interest to you. So one thing that I mentioned was impact analysis. So outside of validation, there is a lot going on as far as how is my algorithm actually going to impact both clinical and economic outcomes when it comes to some of these systems that are being deployed in, right? So we're able to look at this by predicting or looking at the prediction from the AI algorithm, and we can, change that patient's care and see what the outcomes are and what are these kind of potential false negatives or true positives in the potential algorithm's benefits, right? So we're able to compare, hey, if this diagnosis was done earlier in the clinical journey for this patient, what might have been their treatment plan and their overall mortality as a whole, versus it not being kind of deployed, and then what is this expected mortality versus the current, right? So this gains a lot of traction when it comes to understanding, hey, what is the impact on the health system by deploying your algorithm versus not? I guess, Nick, do you want to add a point here?
Yeah, just I think it might be helpful to walk through an example of how we did this with a client. So this slide presents a customer of ours who had an algorithm looking at incidental detection of emphysema on CT scans. And so what we did is we selected a large cohort from 1 year from one health system. And we ran the algorithm on all of the qualifying CTs, generated predictions, and then compared those predictions to what was in the radiology report and what was noted in the EHR for diagnoses. And then we looked at all of the cases where the algorithm said yes, emphysema, and the health record said no. And we then took a portion of those and had them reviewed by radiologists. And we'll be publishing the results of this early next year. But suffice it to say, I think that the algorithm performed well. Most of these pickups were real pickups. And we then did this sort of health economics analysis that's described here to then show prospectively, provide an estimate of what the potential impact is. Obviously, like the gold standard is to have had your algorithm deployed at a hospital system for 2 or 3 years and be able to measure this retrospectively. But that is a luxury that most developers right now don't have. And this is a pretty good substitute.
Right. So in the efforts to kind of speed up that process of truly running a pilot with a health system, this helps kind of give you an idea or some signal around, hey, are the economics right here for a given algorithm? So another way we're working with some clients is via our AI clinical marketplace. Specific here, what we saw here was a need for potential data that might not exist fully in the EMR as a whole. And we might be able to gain some of these labels in this data from things like images, waveforms, things like unstructured data that we can then turn structured via vendors' AI algorithms, right? So the idea here is, hey, say there is a given provider note or report that says one thing, and we're able to actually provide or add a vendor's algorithm onto the raw images or waveforms to add a new clinical label from that helps quantify those specific incidental findings or those findings as a whole. So just to give you an idea here, things like MASH or fatty liver diseases, we're able to obviously abstract things from the text here and give you an idea of what are the experts or providers saying in their notes and reports. We're also able to provide or run an algorithm against the actual images here, or things like serial CTs or MRs, ultrasounds, and actually quantify the liver fat in those images. And this is data that's usually not regularly available or regularly done within clinical care as a whole. So with both these kind of frontiers of both structured data as well as this unstructured data that's being AI clinically powered, we're able to provide folks like pharma or biotechs with additional data that might help them augment some of their clinical trials or the way they're thinking about disease as a whole. I think anything to add there, Nick?
Just to yeah, just to add in, I think for all of you, you could potentially either be customers of this or you could be partners in this, right? On the customer side, if there are labels that you care about that aren't readily available in the EHR, potentially we can use this toolkit to provide you with those labels. Alternatively, if you're working with ECGs or with imaging and the diagnosis or the measurement that you are developing is potentially of interest to pharma companies, then we have sort of a business model by which we partner with AI developers. We deploy your algorithm on our data to enrich it. We then sell that enriched data to pharma companies and share revenue back with the developer. So we can go into a lot more detail on that. Now is the time, but we just wanted to put that out there in case that resonates with any of your use cases.
And I guess finally, another thing that we do for some clients, specific kind of in the pharma and biotech space, is try to help them optimize their overall clinical trials. Similarly, there's various ways for us to do this, but the idea here is we can help optimize their patient funnel as a whole, right? There's quite a bit we can do to enrich their cohort with, vendors' algorithms, like we mentioned, but then as well as kind of adding in things to refine their cohort by abstracting certain symptoms and true episodes from physician notes that they might not have regularly available, and things like claims data, as well as like any of their regularly available data sets that they have internally. So, we pretty much kind of, take their inclusion exclusion criteria. We tend to kind of put this into code somewhere in the realm of over 200 queries in this example. We build them a dashboard to really allow them to kind of look at the analysis and iterate. And then we can validate and apply kind of third-party AI tools to optimize the study so that they can increase their overall number of patients within their funnel. And then because of our health system partnerships, we're actually able to go back to our health systems and potentially, recruit these patients or have them gain access for them to recruit these patients to put on specific trials. So, we'd love to, like, in the future, double down on this and just, truly reduce the time it takes to find and recruit patients as a whole by doing this upfront work and developing this process of increasing kind of the patient optimizational funnel. So anything to add there, Nick?
Yeah, I'd just say this, I think, would be relevant if any of you are working on models that are diagnosing conditions that are underdiagnosed or risk stratifying the probability that patients might have an undiagnosed condition. Or alternatively, another way we've seen this be useful is if you have a tool that is automating the calculation of some metric that is important to pharma that is not commonly captured in the normal course of clinical care. So for example, just where this specific example came from, as I'm sure a lot of you know, there are a bunch of algorithms that have been approved that use ECG waveforms to predict left ventricle ejection fraction from an echo, right? And in this particular case, we had a client that was working on a clinical trial where they needed to have an echo with an LVEF above 50. And that really cut down their patient funnel a lot. And so by applying the ECG algorithm, there are a lot more patients who get ECGs. And that allowed us to sort of expand out the funnel and help them understand that they could use this algorithm to broaden their patient funnel and get more patients in more quickly.
Yep.
All right. I think that is it in terms of slides. I know that's a huge amount of information that we've shared with you, but I would love to open it up for questions.